All right, welcome to class, everyone. Go ahead and grab a seat. Today's explainer is going to completely dismantle a massive myth in modern music history regarding two absolute titans, Miles Davis and Jimi Hendrix. We're looking at the late 1960s, a time when America itself sounded like distortion pedals and free improvisation. Now, the history books often present this era as a battlefield, right? A theoretical jazz rock war. But today, we are going to look at the evidence and discover why that war never actually happened and how it led to a completely new musical universe. Let's take a quick look at the syllabus for today's explainer. We're going to cover 1. The jazz rock war myth, 2. Two revolutionaries colliding, 3. The ultimate 1969 supergroup, 4. Wah-wahs and harmonic maps, 5. Tragedy and default victory, and finally, 6. The blueprint of fusion. All right, part 1. The jazz rock war myth. So you know how history, and certainly the media, absolutely loves a fake rivalry, right? It's just an easy narrative for us to digest. The myth basically tells us that Jimi Hendrix represented the loud, stadium-filling future, while Miles Davis represented an old, acoustic guard desperately trying to survive in smoky, fading jazz clubs. But the core thesis of today's class is that this war never happened. These two were not generals of opposing armies. They were actually co-conspirators. And if there was a war, well, Miles Davis only won it by default. Moving on to part 2, two revolutionaries colliding. When you compare their completely opposite yet perfectly complementary stylistic goals, it's honestly like looking at a group project between the class valedictorian and the senior class rebel. Miles Davis, the high art jazz royalty, was looking at Hendrix's massive stadiums, and he was craving that volume, that danger, and those dark funk rhythms. He wanted movement. Hendrix, on the other hand, was totally exhausted by his wild man of pop persona. He was actively trying to escape the repetitive constraints of psychedelic rock and desperately wanted to learn complex jazz harmony and freer improvisation. They literally had exactly what the other one needed. Which brings us to part 3, the ultimate 1969 supergroup. In 1969, plans were actively set in motion to fuse the absolute peak of jazz improvisation with the loudest textures of rock. And look at this incredible roster they tried to assemble. We've got Miles Davis on trumpet, Jimi Hendrix on guitar, the legendary jazz drummer Tony Williams holding down the rhythm, and, wait for it, Paul McCartney on bass. I mean, just imagine the sheer sonic weight of that lineup for a second. It would have been a tectonic shift in pop culture. And this brilliantly illustrates how real it was. They actually sent a telegram to McCartney at Apple Records in London in October 1969, basically saying, "Join my supergroup." Now, the timing couldn't have been worse for McCartney. The Beatles were completely falling apart. And that very same day, a massive radio rumor had spread that McCartney was actually dead and replaced by a look-alike. McCartney's aide replied that he was on vacation in Scotland. But the fact that this telegram exists, it proves exactly how close we came to this genre-shattering collaboration. But here's the crucial point. This collaboration wasn't an artistic failure. It was an economic one. Miles wanted Hendrix deeply integrated into his electric universe, not just as a quick guest star. But Miles didn't sell records the way Hendrix did. According to some accounts, Hendrix's manager demanded $50,000 just for a single rehearsal session. Miles simply couldn't afford Hendrix's massive price tag for an experimental, unstructured jazz project, so the dialogue had to continue behind closed doors. Okay, part 4, wah-wahs and harmonic maps. You see, Hendrix was desperate to escape the rock god loop. He could play his heart out, absolutely, but he couldn't read sheet music and felt really inhibited by academic jazz players. He looks to Davis to teach him the discipline of harmonic mapping, understanding how to modulate keys, read complex chord structures, and find that spatial discipline so he could improvise way past the standard blues scale. Miles, in turn, was endlessly fascinated by Jimi's use of effects and feedback. If you actually compare their studio recordings from this era, you can hear this cross-pollination happening in real time. Hendrix's Electric Ladyland wasn't just a standard rock album. It essentially became a workshop for sonic abstraction, tape manipulation, and jazz-inflected jams. Meanwhile, Davis's In a Silent Way completely dismantled acoustic jazz from the inside out. He stopped treating jazz as a sequence of polite solos over chord changes, and he started treating it like pure electricity and momentum. Now, a lot of jazz purists accused Miles of selling out, but Davis did not surrender to rock music. He weaponized it. He extracted what we can call the energy architecture of rock. He took the amplification, the volume, the repetitive grooves, and the rhythmic hypnosis of rock, and he fused it with avant-garde jazz composition. He wasn't chasing approval. He was taking the heavy machinery of rock and hauling it right into his own house. Let's turn to part 5, tragedy and default victory. If we trace the timeline here, they spent 1968 and 1969 trading ideas and trying to align their crazy schedules. In August 1970, Miles drops Bitches Brew, fully stepping into the electric realm. But then, just weeks later, in September 1970, Jimi Hendrix tragically passes away at the age of 27. Because of his incredibly sudden death, the defining showdown, the true melding of their minds, was just frozen in time. Miles Davis was left as the sole survivor of their shared vision. With his co-conspirator gone, Miles didn't just retreat back to acoustic jazz. Actually, he conquered the territory Hendrix left behind. To honor that shared vision, Davis successfully absorbed rock aesthetics entirely. He hired aggressive young rock guitarists like McLaughlin. He even physically adopted the wah-wah pedal, which was Hendrix's absolute signature tool. And he plugged his trumpet straight into it. He essentially commanded the rock revolution from a jazz throne, taking over the very army that Hendrix had mobilized. Finally, part 6, the blueprint of fusion. I always get a student raising their hand at this point in the explainer, asking, "Professor, how does modern music actually connect to this era? Is it just old jazz history?" It is a fantastic question. To understand modern experimental music, we have to break down exactly what Davis created when he was left alone to finish the blueprint. Because Davis had the institutional respect of the jazz world, he had the authority to literally plug his genre into amplifiers. In doing so, he birthed fusion. He proved that jazz possessed the structural elasticity to handle the heavy thud of rock drums and electric distortion without losing its soul or its improvisational genius. He legitimized the studio itself as an instrument, using overdubbing and editing to craft massive soundscapes, rather than just recording live takes. Take his 1970 album, Bitches Brew, as an example. It wasn't just a commercial hit that sold 500,000 copies. It became the fundamental DNA for almost every experimental genre of the next 50 years. You can hear its fragmented electric haze in industrial music, noise rock, ambient soundscapes, drum and bass, and even modern hip-hop production. Miles proved that you didn't have to choose between the intellect of jazz and the raw power of rock. You could melt them down together. If you take absolutely one thing away from today's explainer, let it be this. Miles Davis realized early on that genres are just temporary marketing systems. Energy is permanent. Miles Davis won the jazz rock war by default because he lived to keep refining the blueprint, outliving the rigid categories of American music. But I want to leave you with this provocative thought for your next assignment. When you hear Miles Davis aggressively playing his trumpet through distortion pedal in the 1970s, did he really win, or did Jimi Hendrix ultimately win by becoming a ghost that never stops playing? Think about that. All right, class dismissed.